so much for joining us today, Natalie. It is a true joy to have you joining us.
Thanks for having me.
So since you are not currently at the University of Alabama, we'd love for you to give us some basic information about who you are and what you do. And we call this our rapid fire get to know you part of the podcast.
All right. So I'm going to jump in. So first, where are you from or where did you grow up?
I am originally from Alabama, so I think this is the part where I say roll tide.
Yeah, okay.
I grew up in a small town kind of in between Birmingham and Montgomery called Sylacauga, Alabama.
All right.
I did not know this. I did not know that about you.
It's a very small town, but we are famous because we're the only place a person was ever hit by a meteorite. So that is our claim to fame.
Wow.
Wow. That's I feel like I'm going to Google that later to find out.
It's in the Smithsonian. You can visit it next time we have a conference in DC.
DC. That's great.
Okay. Where are you now?
I am now in Austin, Texas. And this is the point where I say hook 'em because I'm an assistant professor at the University of Texas at Austin.
All right. And then when were you at the University of Alabama?
I was at the University of Alabama for as long as I could be until they told me you have gotten all the degrees. It is time to go. So I was there for 8 years from 2006 to 2014. So 8 academic years.
Nice.
So before we jump into the actual conversation about your research, I want to fess up right now and say that I'm one of your many followers on Twitter and all of your other social media platforms, and I totally enjoy it. But what I have to say, or what I think have found so interesting about what you put out on Twitter is that, in my mind, it's very cool content, intentional content. Your posts are always ones that I'll look at. But I always wonder, how the heck does she do it? Because you're like super productive. You're balancing all these many things. And you're not just putting out like random tweets and all this sort of stuff. Is your involvement with Twitter, is it a release for you? Or is it fun? Or do you just kind of like what's following what's going on in the sports world?
Yeah, it's a little bit all the above. For me, it's a release in between, especially when we've been virtual, in between virtual meetings.
Mm-hmm.
If I have a few minutes, I'm going to see what's happening in the world. It also is a place where I get research ideas as well. Take what happened right before the Olympic Games when Sha'Carri Richardson was suspended for marijuana use, and this really interesting discussion developed on Twitter around, well, why is that rule, why is that even a rule? It's not a performance enhancing drug for her. It's not it was legal where she was, and that kind of piqued my research interest. And so now Gary Wilcox, who is also a professor at UT, Kristen Sussman, who is a doctoral student at UT, and I are working on a project about that, where we're going to examine that social media conversation through the lens of crisis communication theory. So,
I love that. That's so cool.
Yeah, so it's a little bit release, a little bit let's find some research ideas and find out what's happening in the world. Because I have a lot of interest in politics. So yeah.
Nice. So I'm going to ask, as you were kind of growing up, or think back, I guess I should say, what did the young Natalie think that she was doing when she grew up?
So young Natalie thought that she would be a United States senator. And I'm not even exaggerating.
Wow.
Nice.
Young Natalie was a very big nerd and had a Time for Kids subscription and kept up with, and on election nights would have electoral maps that she would color in. And from the time I was like 12 years old, I was very interested in politics. However, Now I am interested in following politics, but no longer want to be in politics. But young Natalie thought it seemed pretty fun.
So when did you think like, oh, professor life is for me? Was there like a moment, or how did
Um,
you prepare?
That's a good question. So I think one thing that I often talk about, especially when I work with doctoral students, is the fact that my path was so different to where I am now.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so one, I always say that education is the family business, and both of my parents are educators. My mom was a professor at a community college. She taught British literature. My dad was a principal. They're both retired now, but my brother is an educator. My sister-in-law is a principal. My
Wow.
husband is a professor. His sister is a teacher. His mom is a school librarian. Like, it literally is the family business.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think when I was young, I was like, I am not going to be a teacher. My brother also said the same thing. Haha, here we are. So for me, I ended up in the doctoral program at Alabama, honestly, because when I was in undergrad, I took the research methods class that you're required to take, and I really
Mhm.
enjoyed the class. And the professor of that class, Wes Fondren, said, "Stay after class today." And I was like, "Oh no, what have I done that my professor's asking me to stay after class?" And he said, "Are you interested in doing research? I'd love it if you would come and meet with me with the head of our doctoral program, Dr. Jennings Bryant." And so I said, okay, but I don't think I have any interest in getting a PhD, but sure, I'll like meet with him. Why not? But the thing is then I met with Dr. Bryant, who, of course, just like before I knew it, I was signing up basically. He really spoke to me in a way that made sense. There was a recession, and so I at the time thought I might be going to law school, but I wasn't 100% sure. And he said, "Look, your teachers told me you really enjoy this. You enjoy research. Give us a year. You'll be funded. If you don't like it, you can leave and still have a master's degree." Because again, I'm
Mhm.
coming straight in from undergrad, and that
Mhm.
just sounded incredibly logical to me at the time. And so here I finally find myself in this doctoral program, and it felt a lot at that first year like being pushed into the deep end of a swimming pool and having to figure out how to swim. But fast forward a few years and I'm ready to graduate. And I think a lot of times people end up immediately going into academia.
Mhm.
And but I think it's also helpful for doctoral students to realize that there's other paths that you can take. They're not always easy paths to take, but there
Right.
are other paths there. I say that when I was on the academic job market, I found myself going through kind of a quarter life crisis. of I was on a campus visit actually, and I remember thinking, okay, this will be exactly like the last 8 years, and then my life will never change. It will never look any different than it does right now. I kind of want to do something different first. I want to like work in the field that I'm researching. And so then I met with my dissertation chair, Andrew Billings, and I was like, I think I'm pulling out of the academic job market. And now on the other end of things as a dissertation chair, I can only imagine what he was thinking at the time. I remember him saying, okay, like, well, you have job offers, but do you have job offers like where you're wanting to go? And I was like, no, but I think I'm going to figure it out. And he was panicking, and he's told me since he was panicking internally for me. But always was incredibly supportive and my like biggest cheerleader in life. Like, owe him so much. So anyway, I get a job working in analytics in Chicago for a digital advertising agency, and honestly, that really was another big life trajectory change. So I was loving working in the industry. I was developing testing and analytic solutions for really large brands like Foot Locker and Victoria's Secret and Staples. And then suddenly here I find myself, a friend sent a different job posting, and said, "Hey, will you look this over and let me know what you think?" And I did. And I said, let me see what else is open. And I see the job posting for UT mentioning analytics and sports and things like that, that seemed very tailored to my interests. And I thought, I'm just going to apply and see what happens. And before I knew it, my husband and I are moving 700 miles across the country. And here we are in Austin. So all of that is to say, yes, I was surprised that I ended up in academia twice. I was surprised when I ended up in grad school, and I was kind of surprised when I came back to academia when I did. So, yeah. But there's a lot of different paths you can take in this wild life that we all live.
But I think that's a really good reminder, especially to graduate students now. So many of them, me included, think, if you do this, then the next you just stay in academia. So I think it's important to emphasize that, and I'm glad you've highlighted that. So shifting to the scholarship that you do, can you give us an elevator pitch of your research?
Sure. So my research really looks at social identity and what membership in various social groups, what the effects of that really is. And a lot of my research really focuses on understanding the target market that is sports fans, because sports fans are wild and our fandom makes us do really interesting things. But also recently in the last year, maybe I'm going back to my young Natalie roots, but I've also done some studies to where I'm looking at political identification as well. And what was, really cool is some of that work got picked up and featured on CNN. So that felt like a really cool moment. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask two questions. One is, so related to our fandom makes us do some crazy. And what's one of those things that you have found that our fandom, or I mean, you don't have to use personal experience, but you could. What is one thing that fandom has led to people doing?
Sure. So I'll give a research answer and then I'll give a personal answer because that's more fun, right?
Absolutely.
So research shows that our fandom our identity as a sports fan really becomes our personal identity. So any threats to our sports team feel like a personal threat to us. And a lot of my work looks at sports related crises and athlete crises. And so if our favorite athlete or our favorite team is involved in a crisis, we will speak out on Twitter. We might not always necessarily speak out in the way you would think we would. We might say really wild things, but what we're trying to do is minimize that perceived threat that we are now experiencing personally. So that's one thing that fans will do from a research perspective. From a personal perspective, we have an Alabama room in our home where every wall has Alabama pictures, paintings, like whatever. The wall that the TV is on is painted crimson, and above it, we had a friend who has a vinyl business come in and literally put Roll Tide on the wall. So fandom will make you very silly in Austin, Texas, to turn an entire room in your home into the Bama room. And people walk in and just don't think we're obnoxious at all, I'm sure.
So does that cause any problems being at UT? I mean, you're a huge Bama fan. Do you run into conflict, or do you just have to keep your fandom on the down low?
Well, I'm very open with my fandom, but the conference realignment that just happened this summer has put me in a bit of a pickle. Because I could always say, well, Alabama's my SEC team and UT is my Big 12 team, and it was fine. But now it's going to be a little bit more difficult. But fandom, a lot of times identity is rooted where you go to school, because that's where you spent your formative years. And I'll just share the research on that with anybody who's concerned about that fandom. I'll root for UT as long as they don't play Alabama.
Well, I mean, I'm going to look forward to Matthew McConaughey coming to Tuscaloosa at some point. Right?
Yeah, I'm sure he'll be there for that matchup for sure. It'll be all right.
Yes, exactly.
So, Natalie, think about all of the research that you've done in your career. And if you had to come up with a headline for one of your more interesting findings, what would that be?
Sure. So when I was thinking about what would a headline be, the thing that comes to my mind immediately is really, I mentioned that some of my work was on CNN, and for me that headline was really that sports team identification research can help us understand the aftermath of the 2020 election.
Oh,
And that's why they picked up our work, because this was a part of a report on the election, and my husband and I said we met in the doctoral program. We also co-author a lot. Like our dinner conversations sometimes turn into articles. That sounds incredibly nerdy, but it's true. This was the instance of, we decided to do this article for this report because we talked about it all the time. Like our politics has basically become red team versus blue team.
Mhm.
And then what are the effects of that? And so I talked about how our identity feels so personal, and any threats to that identity will make us do wild things.
mm-hmm.
Well, we kind of saw that in the aftermath of the 2020 election. And for me, why this is an important part is a lot of sports communication researchers kind of feel that our work can sometimes be viewed as, oh, that's a cute hobby, right? Like we're a little bit younger than other subdisciplines of communication research, and I think we kind of sometimes have a chip on our shoulder.
Mm-hmm.
So having that work featured on CNN, and people understanding, no, sports communication research can help us understand a lot of what we're going through right now. It
Mhm.
felt very validating for me, for my husband Mike, and just for us as sports comm researchers to say, see, these things that we write about do have really broad interest. So yeah.
So to follow up on that, Natalie, and let me also say to the listeners, we'll make sure we put a link to that CNN piece in the show notes if you
Sure.
want to access that. But taking this a step further, it seems like a lot of what you do is very practical. So what can you talk a little bit about the application of your work? I mean, certainly you get out there and you get things in academic journal articles and you are super prolific and fantastic at that, but what's the practical, like how do you like make your findings more accessible to the general public?
Sure. So, Austin right now, Austin's a great place to be. UT, as a sports comm researcher, UT's athletic program is just truly incredible. And we also, this year, well, I guess it was supposed to be last year, but we got our first professional sports team, Austin FC. A soccer team. And so as soon as they announced really that they were coming to Austin, I reached out to them, and I've had a couple of lunches with their VP of PR, and we've been talking about, okay, how do you plan from a crisis communication perspective from the founding of a team? So how do you prepare? Because
Wow.
things will inevitably go wrong. So what is the best way to prepare for that? And so I've been able to use a lot of the work that I've done in those conversations to talk about some things that teams have to think about from the get-go. It will help them a lot when these crises happen, because in our digital media society, everybody expects instant responses.
Yes.
So that's one thing. And the other side is, I mentioned that I worked in digital advertising as an analyst. And so sometimes my teaching and my research feels disjointed,
Mm-hmm.
to where I teach analytics, I teach these very practical classes, and I research sports. And I research sports crises. However, recently I've been able to kind of bridge the two a little bit more, and looking at how digital message personalization can really change the crisis communication process. This is something that advertising has been doing for a while, but public relations hasn't been. And so it's very like practical in nature in terms of my interest there. But it feels good to finally bridge my research and teaching a little bit more.
That's really cool. And so I want to go back just to one other thing that you said about the sports comm kind of subfield or area
Mm-hmm.
of new and having a chip on your shoulder a little bit. So when we think about like identity, it is being a sports comm researcher part of your or an identity that you hold, and do you see like a relationship there with doing crazy things because of that part of your identity?
Oh, 100%. I mean, being a sports comm researcher is completely the center probably of my academic identity. Just because when I'm researching and talking about sports, it's such a good way to just teach something like a social identity theory, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like when I'm going over that theory, I teach our Theory 2 course to our first year doctoral students. And whenever we get to that portion, it's really easy to understand us versus them through the lens of sport.
Mm-hmm.
And so that is a part of my identity. The wonderful thing about sports communication and sports media researchers is we have such a close-knit community, a supportive community of researchers who are doing really phenomenal work. We have interest groups and divisions now at the, major conferences. I guess after this conference, I'm the incoming chair of the sports interest group at AEJMC. And the research that I've seen from our conference this year has just been phenomenal. And so if anyone has an interest in sport, I highly recommend they follow that interest, because there's a supportive group of academics at every phase of academic life, from grad school all the way up to full professors, who will be your biggest supporters and cheerleaders. So, yeah.
And it's a really fun group. I say that a little bit selfishly because I'm a part of it, but it's a very, very fun group.
It is, for sure.
So, Natalie, when you think about your professional career, is there one thing that kind of stands out as something that you're the most proud of?
Yeah. So, I guess the thing I'm most proud of are the emails that I get from students who say, "Your class is why I got a job." Like I said, I teach a very practical analytics class, and those skills are really in high demand right now in the advertising industry. And a lot of students come in thinking, I majored in communication because I don't love numbers, but they realize that they are really great analytical thinkers when they put that fear to the side. And so a lot of people, when I get those emails, they feel really good. And equally are when my doctoral students get published. That I thought that it felt really good to get a journal acceptance for myself. It feels even better when my doctoral students get published. Because you see that, teaching first year doctoral students, like I had you for class when I was a first year doctoral student. You see when you might have been one of my very first classes, actually. But you see when these doctoral students come in and they're still kind of unsure of themselves, and academia can really breed feelings of imposter syndrome, and
100%.
you
Yes.
get to see that, like, finally, and I keep telling them, like, you are worthy, you deserve to be where you are, you deserve to be in this fantastic program. But when they get that first publication, it validates them, and it's such a fun thing to see. So the thing that stands out to me professionally are when my students find success, because it feels really good to pay it forward of what so many fantastic professors like you, Dr. Bissell, did for me. So
thank you. Well, I love to hear that, because it's at the end of the day what we're all trying to do. But I want to transition this into something that you had said earlier about Wes Fondren being your research methods professor and then dragging you up to the fourth floor to meet Dr. Jennings Bryant. One of the things we're trying to do throughout this season in the podcast is hear a story about Jennings from all the many guests that we're going to be talking to over the season. So do you have a great Jennings story beyond him sort of saying, all right, just give this PhD program a try?
So I tell everybody that I really do owe Jennings Bryant like my whole life as it is right now, because there's a few moments in your life where you can point to and say that's when everything changed. And that interaction for me was when everything changed, right? I said my trajectory was going somewhere completely different until I met with Jennings that day. But the other part of that story is that Dr. Bryant also recruited my husband to Alabama. So his story is actually really funny, but I guess a few weeks earlier he had met, this is going to be really weird. But a few weeks earlier, he had gone to this psychic that told him, in a few weeks, you will meet a man who will change the course of your life.
Oh my goodness.
And Mike goes to, I know, is this the first mention of like a psychic and intrigue on y'all's podcast?
Yes.
Yep, it is. It is.
I'm happy to be a first. So a few weeks later, he goes out to Las Vegas to present his master's thesis at BEA. And Dr. Bryant comes up to him after his presentation and is basically same thing. Like, you should really come to the University of Alabama. Have you thought about it? And Mike was like, oh no, I hadn't. And then he followed up a little bit. He was working in the advertising industry at the time, and then he couldn't kind of get that interaction out of his mind and decided, you know what, maybe I do want to be a doctoral student. Maybe I do want to teach and be a professor, and applied and got in at Alabama. And so that's where we met. And now, we're married. We have two little rambunctious twin, almost 4-year-old girls. And so, Jennings Bryant really changed completely the course of my life. And so that one I didn't get to have him for class. Unfortunately, we were the last cohort that he brought in. But in doing so, he completely changed our lives. And Mike and I talk about him all the time. And not only that, he's one of also the foundational people in sports comm. So he's really done a lot for my life.
Very cool.
That's a wonderful story. I love that.
So we'll shift gears just a little bit again. And as an academic, you have experience with revising and resubmitting articles, and even just kind of revising and kind of resubmitting in your mind, kind of thoughts for research. How do you go about with that process? What is that like, and how do you persist through that process?
This is a really good question. So I always tell my doctoral students that the revise and resubmit process is one of the most important things in graduate school that you'll learn working with a professor, and to really pay attention and ask questions and ask how to respond to certain reviewers. And the first thing I do is I'll read through comments. And for me, I can sometimes get a little defensive internally. So I'm going to be self-aware about that emotional reaction and call myself out. So I'll read through comments and then I'll leave it alone for a couple days and process those feelings. I'm a big feeler personality type. So then I come back to it and I try to take each comment and really boil it down to, okay, what are they trying to say here? Because some reviewers are really good at being really to the point. I had an article, I think last year, I had to go through 3 rounds of revision with it. And it was just one reviewer who was holding out and would send me feedback that was just, 3 paragraphs that could have been boiled down to 1 sentence. And so, I think the amount of time that this person spent on reviewing my article in terms of just length of what they wrote could have been an article in itself if you compiled all the reviews. So, but it can be tricky, right? And so I always tell students it's important to really be respectful, to boil down to what are they trying to say, to make the review process also easy for the reviewers. So in your reviewer letter, that's your persuasive document. Really an academic journal article is a persuasive document as well, right? And I think we lose sight of that sometimes, but the key to the narrative of that journal article is that it's persuasive. You're building up the case of why there is this thing that needs to be addressed and your study is going to do it. and then you're building the case as to why your study did it, and it really is significant and matters. So the whole thing's persuasive. Same thing with an R&R letter. You're really trying to persuade, one, that you heard the reviewer, that I see you, I hear you, and then two, that you really are going to take their feedback and make your paper better. But just in terms of having a reviewer letter that says, like, I made this page on page whatever, and it's highlighted in the document. I mean, it sounds so simple, but making it an easy process for reviewers, because academics are so busy, and sometimes we put off our reviews until the last minute.
Yep.
Never.
So, little things like that can really make a big difference in that process. But especially for graduate students, get input from your professors, ask questions. Like, you're right there. It's like, you just gotta, like, you get to just kind of tip the ball into the hoop, or you're right, you know, like, you're in the red zone. You just have to, like, you're about to score a touchdown with that article if you just really handle that R&R well. So that would be my advice, is ask for help if you're confused on how to deal with something. If you have reviewers who are contradicting each other, that can be tricky, because that happens, right?
Yeah.
And so you kind of have to make the persuasive case, really, like, dig into the literature, find good citations for the letter too. And if you make that good case, I mean, I feel like it's turned out pretty well for me in the past.
That's really great advice. And I think what you noted earlier about, you know, it's hard sometimes to read any sort of letter that's ultimately rejecting your work. But I think, you know, reading it and then thinking about it and processing it, and not having that, you know, not letting that emotional reaction drive it is such good advice. And so I want to tie this in to the next question. For our listeners who are new to, or newer to academia, or newer to communication research, there's a lot of minutia. I mean, we get to teach, we get to do research, we get to interact with others at conferences, but there are days, weeks, months. This last year is a great example where it's really hard to push through. So what do you do, Natalie, when you hit those points? What do you do to stay motivated?
That's a good question. I mean, I think this is something that we probably need to talk about more in academia.
Yes.
Is that we all are, I mean, right now we are working through a global pandemic. A lot of us in the last year had to completely change our teaching modality and learn how to do it well, or to the best of our ability. We've been in kind of surviving, not necessarily thriving mode, but we do still have to push through. Especially for those of us who are on the tenure clock, or graduate students who are, you know, the job market feels like it's always looming over you. And I think it's recognizing those feelings, and recognizing that everyone feels that way. So there's nothing wrong with you feeling like, I just can't do anything today. And giving yourself that time and space to walk away. I tell doctoral students a lot, when they send me a manuscript, I'm like, okay, like, great. Don't do anything else for a little bit. This is a huge accomplishment in and of itself. And I think it's also recognizing patterns and teaching students how to set healthy boundaries and respecting their healthy boundaries. I caught myself this past spring in my doctoral class. I was going to give them an extension on an assignment, just because we're in the middle of the pandemic and, like, everyone needs extensions, let's be honest. So I'm like, here, y'all can have an extension till Sunday night. And then I followed up immediately and was like, I am so sorry, because that rewards you for working on the weekend. The weekend should be your time to relax, rest, and recharge. That deadline is extended till Wednesday. And so I think it's setting and trying to model that behavior for students, because almost the academia, this culture of, like, almost a competition of who works the most and who is the busiest happens in our conversations at conferences. And I'm a firm believer that that's not healthy. And so I think it's important that we set those healthy boundaries. And so for me, when I'm feeling that way, I step away for a little bit. And then to get myself started back, I try to make big goals feel a lot smaller. If I put on my to-do list, write an article, like I love crossing something off a to-do list, and that will not motivate me because I can't cross that off for a while. So it will be, I give myself maybe like a word goal or a section goal if it's just like an introduction or something. Like today I'm going to write an intro for this paper, or I'm going to put this questionnaire up on Qualtrics and get it set up in like Prolific so that I can start collecting data. So I try to make each project feel smaller for me, because when I'm able to cross those small tasks off my to-do list, it gives me a mental boost. And it's also showing, hey, sometimes it may not have felt like you made a lot of progress, but you really did make a lot of progress this week.
That is such great advice. I was like writing things down, thinking the show notes for you will be pretty much a novel because we have all these wonderful takeaways from everything that you said. Thank you so much for that. That's awesome.
Oh, well, thank you.
So as we kind of wrap up, we want to do that in a little bit of the same way that we started, with a couple more rapid fire questions.
Sure.
My first question is, what is your favorite academic conference to attend?
I think for me, it's AJMC, because I said before I'm the incoming chair of the sports communication interest group, and it's just a fantastic conference. I think I listened to a panel with a lot of Bama alums. Roll Tide.
Roll Tide.
Mia Long Anderson, Keenan Brown, who is still at Alabama, and Josh Dickhouse, and they were with Keontae Coleman, and they did a panel on athlete activism during the COVID-19 pandemic. That was probably my favorite academic panel I've ever attended. It was so good.
Wow.
Cool.
So love that conference.
And where is a place that you are looking forward to going if a conference happens to be there in the future?
Oh, Paris for ICA. I think that's every academic scholar's answer right now.
Yep.
But I'm also like I'm a terrible flyer.
Oh,
so,
no.
And that's a really long flight. So I'm just going to do the best I can. And it's going to be interesting to see if my husband's even willing to sit next to me on a flight that long, because I'm that much of a nervous flyer. It's a control thing. I'm not the one flying the plane. So it makes me nervous. That's everything you need to know about my personality in one statement.
I can.
My husband will not sit with me on a long flight. Period.
See, I'm not alone.
I can empathize.
Natalie, it has been so great catching up with you today and hearing about all of the many fantastic things you've done since you've been at C&IS and at the University of Alabama. Thank you for taking the time to chat with us today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. This was so much fun.
It was. Thank you so much, Natalie. Have a great day.
Thanks, Natalie.
Oh, sorry, I think I lost y'all for a second, but thank y'all. This was so much fun today. I really appreciate it.